Hello everyone, welcome to my patch 14.17 tier list. Quite a bit changed this patch. There was some pretty sizable systems changes, so the big ones being to Fleet and Absorb Life, and also they did directly buff and nerf quite a few mid champs, and also there's a couple indirect buffs and nerfs that do affect mid lane as well. So what I'll do is I'll go through all the ones that affected. If all you care about is the tier list, it's on screen obviously here. But there will be timestamps in the description below if you want to skip around to all the different champs. So first we need to take a look at these system changes. And obviously the Fleet and Absorb Life ones are the biggest because these have kind of dominated mid lane for most of this split. So the main reason these were so OP is because they gave so much sustain to the point where mages couldn't really poke either AD carries or some of these like melee carries like Yone or Yasuo. They just couldn't really be poked out of lane because it was just simply too much sustain. So the Absorb Life nerfs are pretty significant. I would say Absorb Life is pretty dead as a rune, at least for the early game. It is still quite good in mid game, but it takes a really long time to come online. So I feel like Absorb Life is kind of dead. Fleet is still not bad. It is getting some more changes next patch, but I think Fleet, even though it's, it is slightly nerfed, it's still reasonably strong. And I think there are definitely some champs that are still running Fleet, although you have also seen some other champs swap. So, I mean, you'll see this on the list, but champs like Smolder have swapped from Fleet to stuff like Grass, and people are just in general experimenting with some of them. But what does this mean for mid? Well, Absorb Life is early game. Absorb Life being nerfed is a positive to any sort of like mage champion that wants to poke your opponent out of lane. Now, I will say it's actually a nerf to mages in the mid game, because if you compare a champ like Syndra, right? Let's compare Yone and Syndra. So Yone, by the time Yone is in the mid game, there's plenty of sustain, right? He's got Bork, his fleet will have scaled up. So at that point, Absorb Life doesn't really matter because you're already overcapping your healing. But for a champ like Syndra, you just don't have any sustain in the mid game at all. So Absorb Life giving you, say, plus 70 to 100 HP per wave later in the game is actually quite significant, because it means if you get poked out or chunked in some way, or if you want to do a jungle camp, you're actually allowed to still stay on the map. So I would say this overall, this nerf is a net positive for most mages, and I guess it's also a nerf to any sort of champ that needed to neutralize the lane, right? Like anything that was either had lots of losing matchups or was just looking to survive is definitely a little bit hurt by this. And so the main people that are punished are probably the AD carries that were able to just out-sustain mages, like stuff like Zeri that would just, completely tank any sort of mage damage, and it was completely fine. Garen and Nasus obviously big abusers of this as well. That being said, like I said before, I think Fleet is still in a decent spot. It's really just Absorb Life that was nerfed. And there is an argument that like Garen and Nasus and stuff had so much sustain anyway, right? Like with the Absorb Life, Fleet, Second Wind, D-Shield, Vamp Scepter, that they might just have enough sustain anyway. So it's something definitely to keep an eye on. But a few changes, or I have made a few changes to the tier list as a result. Now we're going to go through champ by champ. So the first one on our list, and the one that I have at the very highest, is LeBlanc. And LeBlanc's in kind of a weird spot, because I think that LeBlanc is, in my opinion, the best AP champ in solo queue, but APs are definitely like a little weaker, especially because like AP junglers are still quite strong, right? Like if you have something like a Lilia, you really don't want to play LeBlanc with that, right? LeBlanc is very good if you've got a ganking support, right? So if you've got a Rela Leona, and then you've got an AD jungle like a Xin Zhao or Lee Sin or something like that. But if you don't have those tools, if you don't have the ganking don't have the ganking jungle support, and you have like an AP jungler or something, then LeBlanc's falling way, way down, right? Like she is only S tier because she is basically the best AP option for that. I think the LeBlanc nerfs they don't really impact her, spot in the meta. I don't think. The reason LeBlanc is so strong is got amazing 2v2, and she's extremely, extremely strong in the early game. Because of sudden impact, she just wins lane against a lot of things that she used to lose lane to. And, being a champ that is so strong and used to be reliant on receiving ganks, and now just like outright wins her lanes is, it's a pretty big problem. So I think LeBlanc is still very strong. Obviously, these scaling nerfs do hurt her a little bit later on, but a lot of the time you will overkill people anyway. I guess it does hurt your poke a little bit. So yeah, there is something to be said for this damage being lost, and it definitely punishes you a little harder if you were an average LeBlanc, because LeBlanc does get more difficult to play as the game goes on, and now it's even more difficult. But I still think in the hands of a good player, or a good LeBlanc player, it's probably still going to be fine. Aurora got a pretty heavy nerf to her ult, and I actually think this is, it's pretty significant, right? Like, it's 75 damage later on, although ultra late game, you might just be using this purely for the CC and less so for the damage. but it still adds up, right? And a little bit of damage loss in the early game can be annoying as well, especially if you're hitting multiple targets. The thing is, I think Aurora is still very, very strong for a few reasons, right? Like, she is a flex pick, and actually she is probably played top a little more often than mid. So in that sense, like, she really gains value as a flex pick because, you know, if picking on red side especially, and your top laner has last pick, they might not know where the Aurora is going, and that can allow you to get much better matchups. That's really nice. I think just the champ in general is super broken. Like, the ulti is just way too strong, so I think she still deserves S tier. I guess the biggest nerf to Aurora this patch is that the champs that tend to punish Aurora are champs like Syndra, Ori, some longer range champs as well, you know, stuff like Azir. And Absorb Life was a way of dealing with that. Now, there is a Comet Aurora page where people max E with Comet, and they would go, I believe it was Comet Sorcery. No, actually, Comet is Sorcery. It would have been Comet Domination. Yeah, that's right, because they used to take Sudden Impact and Ultimate Hunter. So in that sense, like, some of the meta builds for Aurora didn't actually have Absorb Life in it, but I think Absorb Life was quite useful for some of those harder matchups. So maybe if you're blind picking Aurora and they know it's mid, I think you're maybe a bit punishable, more punishable than before. At the same time, though, you've got insane gang setup against these immobile mages, so there's still a win condition there, and it is really hard for them to team fight against you, but maybe be a little careful of picking this if your top laner has already shown their pick. I think that's the only thing really to be careful of. The next one I really wanted to talk about was Sylas, because Sylas is pretty strange to me. So Sylas actually did get nerfed this patch, which I actually thought Sylas was pretty weak. I thought if anything, Sylas was going to get a buff. Potentially it's just kind of overwhelming in some of the lower elo games, because I think Sylas is one of those champs where he really does need to be punished hard in lane, and also if Sylas ever does get ahead, he's really, really problematic. So Sylas did get nerfed, and I think I have him, you know, fairly middle of the pack on my tier list. Now, one thing I will say, and I haven't experimented with this at all, is there was a game Chovy played recently of just the full tank Sylas build in top lane, and, you know, one game sample size, but seems to have been good. And potentially some sort of tank. I'm not sure if this is the build, but I think there is probably some sort of like Bruiser-esque build. I know people did try Liandry Riftmaker builds, but I think they just fell too far behind in lane to really come online. But I think if a build like this is viable, then I could see Sylas being very, very strong in solo queue, because I mean, it is just like a really good solo queue champ. But at the moment, you just fall too far behind to ever really come online, unless you've got, you know, absolutely amazing ults like Alistair or Rel, Leona to take. It's just not worth the deficit that you put yourself at. That being said, if you get a good matchup, it's always a good solo queue champ. So definitely one to, it's kind of useful, I guess, to have in your pool somewhere. This patch, Ryze also got some changes, which is pretty exciting because I really like Ryze. So he got 5 damage at all ranks on his Q, and then, you know, a pretty sizable reduction on his level 1 ult. Overall, I think the Ryze changes, in my opinion, they don't really fix the problems that Ryze had. So the thing with Ryze is that he's a champ with a really weird identity. So Ryze is very misunderstood. I think that even though Ryze in theory scales well, right, he really struggles to deal his damage in the late game because he is just too short range. And so you're kind of relegated to split pushing in the late game a lot of the time because, you know, there's just so much CC, especially with all the melee supports, that it's just so hard to play a team fight, and unless you're really, really far ahead. So Ryze is kind of in a spot where he sort of needs to snowball the early game, maybe not necessarily by getting kills, but just by, like, you know, roaming, having really high CS, impacting the other lanes and stuff like that. And then in the mid game, you need to spend so much time side laning and just taking camps and making sure you're higher HP and higher level than anyone else. And I think these changes don't really make a big difference, right? Like, I think Ryze isn't really lacking for damage, and also Ryze doesn't have a, you know, a champ like Ahri has a point where she can one-shot the wave with her Q, right? And it's not really like that for Ryze. There's not a point where, you know, you're suddenly going to be able to kill it in 1 less Q for having 5 more damage. I will say the lower cooldown on ult is kind of nice. That does help in snowballing the early game, right? Like, if you're able to make 1 extra play because your ult is up in time, that actually does make a pretty big difference. But I think overall, Ryze still has some pretty sizable issues, and probably not a champ that you want to pick blind. But maybe if you see that the enemy has also short range, or they don't have a lot of CC, or you really think you can snowball your mid matchup, there are a couple like Akali and Vladimir, 2 that I really like to pick into. There are still some situations for Ryze to be. Lissandra received some pretty nice buffs. So as you can see here, Lissandra got a little bit of damage on her Q at later ranks, which is kind of nice. I think that Lissandra is one of those champs where if you fall a little bit behind, you can suddenly really start to struggle with clearing waves, where if you are like reasonably strong and you're able to clear the backline, especially in 1Q, that makes a really big difference. And having an extra 20 damage at rank 5 in the queue absolutely does make a difference for that, which is really, really cool. And also the slow being increased is really, really nice. And I think Lissandra getting buffs is, again, kind of surprising. I think that Lissandra is already very good in solo queue, and I have rated her quite highly and potentially too highly. And the reason I did this is because I think Lissandra is just one of those champs that is just very strong in solo. Right? Like, even if you fall behind in lane, or you don't maybe receive the ganks that you should, you are just an incredibly strong skirmisher and team fighter. But she does have some weaknesses, which again is like getting poked out and getting outscaled is another one. And I think absorb life nerfs are maybe a negative to Lissandra. Like, it is kind of nice to have that to sustain some of those lanes. And I think you probably do want to use Lissandra more as a counterpick. You know, if you do get into like melee champ that you can CC a lot, or into one of these assassins that really needs to snowball, you can be in a really good position. I do think though, you know, like if you're looking at Lissandra into most of these meta picks up here, honestly, it's not amazing. The best matchup probably is LeBlanc versus, or Lissandra versus LeBlanc, which is very finicky. If you don't know how to play this matchup, I would actually just say it's straight up LeBlanc favored. But if you play Electrocute Bone Plating, I do think Lissandra can kind of neutralize the lane against LeBlanc and then does really well to her in team fights. And I think that alone, you know, being a counterpick to one of the strongest mids in the patch does give you a lot of value. But I think just be a little careful. Don't get baited too much by this up here. If you're playing Lissandra into one of these champs that does bully you in the 1v1 or does just get free scaling, you're going to be kind of unhappy with it. That being said, you know, it's if you're blind picking and you've ended up with a bad matchup, like no champ's perfect, and I think Lissandra is still going to be very high impact. So very similar to Lissandra, TF just got a little bit of extra damage on Q, which I think, you know, I don't think you're ever really playing TF for the teamfight damage, but I think, again, just being able to clear the wave that little bit easier might make the difference. I think that TF kind of already reaches that point pretty stably, though. You know, I think it's different compared to a champ like Lissandra where you can kind of fall behind that curve. I think TF is able to clear the wave most of the time, but again, you know, a little bit of extra damage, it does add up, and potentially can make the difference, you know, if you are trying to one-shot someone. I don't know, maybe an extra 20 damage does make a difference. I mean, look, you won't say no to it. For me, I don't think it really changes TF's position at all. I do have TF kind of lower on mine, and obviously B tier, like these champs are still very solid, but I think if you're looking for some sort of like mid 2v2 champ, you have a lot of options right now. You know, you have the LeBlanc or Aurora, you've got like your Ari, Lissandra, even something like Talia with Vi, or Gallia or something. So I think you're so spoiled for choice, and it's not often like that, to be honest. Like a lot of the time, these champs that like set up, there is just one that is way better than the others, and so you play that every time. But I think actually right now there's a lot of options, and I think all of them are a lot better than TF, at least in my opinion. Like, I don't think the champ's unplayable by any means, but I think a lot of these up here are just stronger versions of them pretty much. Now I just want to go through and talk about some of the champs that I think are kind of different in the meta, or that I haven't talked about before. It has been a little while since I made a tier list. And the first one would be Smolder. So Smolder obviously does suffer from the Fleet Absorb life nerfs, but a lot of people are just playing him with Grasp now, which I think is very, very strong. So the way your trading pattern works is you just stack up your Grasp and then you try and Q your opponent. And Smolder actually is quite strong in lane. It's kind of in a weird position where, you know, if you do versus something else that is like a real lane bully like LeBlanc or Syndra, it can be tough. But against most other things, you are tanky enough that you can survive any sort of all-in. And with your rune page, you're able to, you know, survive poke and stuff like that. And Smolder scales extremely, extremely well. He's also a triple flex. He gets played AD and top counterpick as well, which is really nice. And he probably is one of the, yeah, I mean, at least top 2 AD mids to play alongside a, you know, AP jungler like Lilia this patch, which is really nice. Really, the biggest downside to Smolder is either, again, getting hard countered if your team shows, for example, their ADC and the top laner as well. Also, I think you do need to be a tiny bit careful of if there are too many skirmishes in the early game. You know, if you play something like Smolder Lilia, this is extremely strong as the game goes on. But, you know, if you're trying to take a skirmish as Smolder Lilia against, say, like LeBlanc Lee Sin, good luck, right? Like, you're just going to get absolutely destroyed. So be a little bit careful of taking those fights early. But I think, you know, champ, especially mid lane, I think is really strong. You know, I think even though it can be played top and AD, I do think mid lane is actually the best spot for it. And I really like Smolder mid. I think it's quite strong at the moment. Zeri, so Zeri definitely took a little bit of damage in the sense that Fleet Absorb Life probably does hurt her more than maybe any other champ on this list. That being said, Zeri was so overtuned that I think she is still completely fine. I think it's probably at the point where, like, if you want to invest time into it, it probably is still worth it, but it's definitely I definitely think you're expecting Zeri to leave the meta soon enough, and I believe it is actually getting directly nerfed next patch. But there is still a little time to abuse it if you do want to. There is also this new dynamic of Garen and Nasus mid, and I think this is a little overdue, to be honest, because I think that being able to, pressure the side lane, as well as just, like, again, AD mids are quite strong with the current AP jungle pool. It's nice to have an AD mid that is able to, possibly contest prior, and especially win the side lane. So the thing with Garen and Nasus is a couple things. So Garen's popped up as a Nasus counter specifically, but I actually think Garen is better in general. So the thing with Nasus is that Nasus is a specific counter to these AD carry mids. The Wither Slow is quite strong, and it's also quite good into Azir. But I think that overall, Nasus is just kind of a weaker champ, whereas I feel like Garen has, faster wave clear, comes online earlier. I think he's harder to deal with in team fights, and also I would say is a better blind. Like there are a lot of mages, especially ones with phase rush or ones with dashes or the ability to kite, something like Aurora that can do really, really well with Nasus. But honestly, dealing with Garen is not that easy. Like you can play something to outscale. Like I played a game of Syndra versus Garen, and like you do scale really well, right? But you can't really take advantage of it, right? And if you're counterpicking, there are, of course, a couple ways to win. You can dominate your lane, you can just play the scale or whatever. And playing the scale is fine, but ideally, you would win lane and outscale, right? And I think Garen is a really hard champ to take advantage of. So I really think Garen mid is super strong at the moment. And again, the flex pick potential, it goes a long way, right? Like if you're on the fourth pick on red side and you lock in Garen, they're not sure if it's going mid or top. That allows you and your top laner to get more favorable matchups, which is really, really nice. Another one I have pretty high here is Sol. So Sol's getting quite a lot of play in higher elo, and there's a couple different builds. I'm not honestly sure what the best build is. I think one of the best things actually is that I believe Absorb Life nerf is really good for Sol, because Sol always kind of wanted to go Presence of Mind just for the extra mana, but you kind of had to go Absorb Life just to keep up with everyone else's, right? So the overall sustain level being lower, Sol being able to go Presence of Mind, I think that allows you to skip mana if you want. You kind of saw before that people would either go tier into the old build, like they go tier Rylai Liandry and just sit on the tier, or upgrade into Seraphs if they wanted. Or you would see this Blackfire build, which is just allows you to get more stacks, just you have more mana and more CDR. The thing is, I mean, I think that the tier Rylai's build, or just the Rylai's Liandry build, is the best, and I think that being able to take Presence of Mind and Mana Flow and that being fine is super, super nice. So I think the build path for Sol is in a really, really good spot. I mean, he does do well into a lot of the champs at the moment. There definitely are some harder matchups, but overall, I think he is really strong. He's probably not the best blind. Like, I think if you're blinding mid, you probably do look for other things first, but definitely one of the things where you don't necessarily need to counter, you just need to know that your matchup isn't horrific, right? As long as you can avoid some of the things, like I probably wouldn't want to play versus Syndra or Yarn maybe. I think pretty much anything else will be fine, but just make sure these are off the table. Zed's another one that I have pretty high, and it might be the highest you guys have seen it for a while. So I think Zed is really, really strong in solo queue. And when I was in Korea, I played against so many Zeds. I played against Z99, I played against On Zed, there was another one, I can't remember his name, but I played against Zed all the time. I mean, I think he is really, really good. So he's one of those stronger AD mids. He scales pretty well. He's got good side laning. He can honestly neutralize pretty much any lane because he can go deep shield and he can just like farm from range, which is super, super valuable. So I am a big fan of Zed. I feel like the biggest weakness to Zed is that some of the matchups are actually quite hard 1v1. You've got champs like LeBlanc or Hui that really can bully Zed. The problem is though that, like against Hui, Zed can really hard pressure that in the side lane. And for a champ like LeBlanc, there is still like a fair amount of kill pressure for the Zed. So it's, definitely not like you're completely out of the game for being in that matchup. And even some pseudo counters like Lissandra, I'd actually say are like somewhat Zed favored. So yeah, a lot of the time you can actually get yourself a favorable matchup, even if you're blinding Zed, although there are some harder ones, and I think some of the bruises, like maybe something like a Garen, I could see that being pretty unplayable, or at least unkillable, but at the same time, right, you can't just farm. So I think Zed, criminally underrated in solo queue at the moment, and is just in general a pretty strong solo queue champ, just overall. One that might be a bit of a surprise for you guys is Kennen being so strong. So I think Kennen, for similar reasons as Nasus and Garen, is just a strong flex pick, right? Like you can take Kennen on your 4th pick red side, they're not sure where it's going. A lot of the time, they'll just assume it's top, and that can allow your top lane to have a really good matchup. I think Kennen in general is just a very, very strong champion, even after nerfs. And a lot of the matchups that do well into Kennen in the 1v1 really suffer at getting ganked. You know, like if you pick something like Syndra into Kennen, there's a good chance that you can still get a kill just by flashing on her with your jungler at some point. And the champs that tend to do a bit better against Kennen, you know, the ones with a bit more mobility, can be bullied out in the 1v1. So I think that's very, very nice. Mainly, though, the value is the flex pick potential. You can also kind of pick them into certain melee champs, right? Like, I think it's completely fine to play Kennen into, say, Nasus or Garen, although you're probably not going to get as much value in the short lane as you would compared to top lane. But definitely a nice champ and something that I've been playing a lot of recently. Down in the B tier, I have Naafiri, and this is a champ that I think if you're below Master tier is probably just like an easy slam dunk, like high A tier, potentially even S. But I think as you get higher, it can definitely start to struggle in some of the lanes, right? Like there are definitely things that, like LeBlanc, for example, if she uses her chain well, can be really rough, and just some of the stronger lane bullies like Aurora can make Naafiri's life difficult. But if you get a good matchup for Naafiri, I think Champ is very, very easy to execute, and honestly is just extremely hard to deal with if it gets, you know, any form of lead at all. So I like Naafiri, and I think it's a champ that people should be looking at a little bit more. But you just really need to make sure that you're avoiding the harder matchups. Personally, I would not blind it, but if you get a good game for it, it's going to go absolutely nuts. Also in B tier, I have some random flexes, so just similar vein to before. I have stuff like Cassante and Rumble, Gragas, you know, Tryndamere, Aatrox. I think there are a lot of these top laners that are completely functional mid, and if you can get a draft advantage with it, then it is worth it. I think that, you know, if you can't play these champs, it's probably not worth investing into, but, you know, if you queue mid-top, and you play a lot of top champions as well, or you have one of these that you really want to add to your pool, maybe you really like playing the bruises or something, I think it's completely fine to play them mid. And I actually think they're kind of underrated in general. So yeah, could be something to try. Speaking of underrated, while I was in Korea, I did play against a lot of Diana and Ekko mid one tricks, and I've kind of always been on the opinion that Diana and Ekko mid have kind of sucked just because they've been much better in jungle. Right? Like I think both Diana and Ekko kind of do have laning phase problems. And, you know, in the jungle where you can just kind of full clear or, you know, take opportunistic ganks in order to get your first item, that generally feels a lot better. But there are, I guess, a couple things. So Halo Blades Ekko is something that people used to do specifically into Syndra. But the Ekko one tricks I played in Korea, they would just take Halo Blades pretty much every single game. So that, I mean, I really like that. And I think that what you can do is you can kind of use that Halo Blade strength to coast along until, you know, maybe like level 5 or so, and then like at that point you're starting to get more points in queue after your first base, getting kind of like level 7, level 9. You know, you're getting to the point where even if your matchup sucked, you really are at the point where you can just wave clear, right? So using that Halo Blades kind of as a bridge to get you through that tough early lane to the point where you can just reach your wave clear, and then from that point, like, you are just a strong side laner and a strong team fighter as well. So I think that's really, really nice. And Diana was, yeah, kind of interesting. I think that for me, like, I didn't really like Diana before because, you know, you've obviously got the Q poke, which is quite hard to deal with. You know, it's hard to dodge Diana Q, and it does do a lot of damage. But a lot of the time, it's like, okay, even if she's like she's got like the stats, right? And similar to a champ like Naafiri, she wants to just go on you and stat check you, and that's it. I think she kind of struggled to deal with some of the, you know, stronger stat check champs. But I think the really nice thing with Phase Rush Diana especially is that you can just get in, get your trade, get out, and a lot of the time, like, your opponent won't be able to trade back meaningful damage before you disengage. And I also think in easier matchups, it's fine to go for something like Electrocute, Sudden Impact, knowing that you don't really need the Phase Rush to run away because you can just stat check your opponent. So I think I'm still of the opinion that these champs are better in jungle, but I actually think they're a little underrated mid, and they're probably something I will experiment with a little more while I'm here in Europe. The very last one I want to talk about on this list is Kassadin, which I have moved up. I still think he's overall not great, but potentially he is a good counter pick. So I think Kassadin has kind of struggled because there's been so many AD mids, and even the AP mids have been kind of difficult for Kassadin to deal with, just because they're so strong in lane, a lot of them. But I think now, you know, I would say the meta is slowly shifting back towards things that might be good for Kassadin. You know, like I see things like blind pick Talia, and I think that can be a really, really good game to go for Kassadin. Potentially, you know, there are some other ones here, like if people start to blind pick Ari a bit more, again, Kassadin kind of gets free scaling, and that's really nice. So there are maybe more Kassadin windows to look for than before. It's still kind of difficult because, you know, the game is very fast paced, and one of the biggest nerfs to Kassadin was the addition of grubs. Because, you know, that level 6 grub fight, if you have a strong ultimate, right, think of something like, a lot of the time the top laner just decides it with like Kennen or Renekton, Rumble, etc. But it can be the same from mid. You know, like there are a lot of strong level 6 ultimates, Aurora as an example. And if you lose the Grubs fight, obviously it's not the end of the game, right? But it's like, okay, well, if we can't contest the Grubs, like maybe we also can't contest the Dragon as well. And suddenly we can kind of come out of early game being down plays, down objectives, and it's still winnable, of course, but it's like, you know, what did we get out of this? Like, did we really get a super scaling pick in mid? Even though Kassadin scales well, it's like, is he scaling way better than something like Smolder or Sol? I would honestly say not really. So yeah, I don't know. It's like a decent champ. There's probably some windows for it, but I think just because those windows seem to still be kind of few and far between, I have them rated a little lower. So I think that'll be it for this tier list. I have missed a couple patches, but hopefully this one will give you guys a good update. If you do have any more questions, please leave them in the comment section below. Otherwise, you can come to my stream, twitch.tv/ShokLol. I am in EU at the moment. Yeah, hopefully that'll be good for you guys. Anyway, again, any more questions, put them below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next.